There is a version of this story that should be impossible. A head coach wins more games over 9 seasons than every single team in the entire NFL except one. The dynasty in Kansas City itself. He takes a franchise that hadn't sniffed the playoffs in 17 years and turns it into a perennial contender, appearing in the postseason in 8 of 9 seasons and capturing 5 AFC East titles along the way. And that same coach gets fired, not quietly reassigned, not given one more year to figure it out. Fired, in the middle of an era defined by arguably the best quarterback in football. That's exactly what happened to Sean McDermott in Buffalo this offseason, and understanding why it happened and what comes next tells you almost everything you need to know about where this franchise actually stands heading into training camp. Let's start with the number that explains this entire decision, because it's almost impossible to argue with once you actually see it laid out. From 2017 through 2025, Sean McDermott's Buffalo Bills won more regular season games than every single NFL franchise except the Kansas City Chiefs. Think about what that actually means. 9 years of sustained, elite-level regular season football matched by almost nobody in the sport during that stretch. And yet here's the number that ended his tenure anyway. In that same span, while Kansas City was capturing 5 AFC titles and 3 Super Bowl championships, Buffalo captured 0 of each. Owner Terry Pegula summed up the decision himself, saying directly that he felt like the organization had hit what he called the proverbial playoff wall, year after year after year. With Josh Allen turning 30 in May and a championship window that everyone in that building understands is not infinite, Pegula decided that being very good was no longer an acceptable standard. That's a brutal, almost cold-blooded organizational philosophy. But it's also exactly the mentality a franchise needs if it genuinely believes it's sitting on a championship-caliber roster that keeps finding new ways to fall just short. And the way this ending actually happened deserves real attention, because it wasn't some slow-building mid-season collapse. It was one specific agonizing sequence of football that has haunted Bills Mafia for months now. In the AFC divisional round against the Denver Broncos, Buffalo's offense put up 30 points. 30 points in a playoff game against a genuine championship contender. And the defense, McDermott's own defense, the unit that had defined his coaching identity since the day he arrived in Buffalo, allowed 33. Denver's offense, led by a second-year quarterback on a team that wasn't exactly known as an offensive juggernaut, marched down the field late and converted a critical 3rd and 11 while McDermott's defense sat in the kind of soft zone coverage that had become a recurring, painful theme in the biggest moments of his tenure. That was the 7th consecutive year, according to reporting on the decision. That McDermott's defense had failed to deliver a stop when the season was truly on the line in an elimination game. 7 years. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. And organizations that are serious about winning championships eventually have to confront patterns, no matter how much success came before them. The emotional layer to this story is genuinely worth sitting with too, because the man who replaced McDermott didn't celebrate the opportunity. Joe Brady, who had been Buffalo's offensive coordinator and was elevated directly into the head coaching chair, spoke publicly about how devastating that period actually was for him personally. He described himself as broken. Broken for a coach who had given him his opportunity in the first place, and broken for the rest of the staff who suddenly found themselves without jobs in the same moment he was being promoted into the biggest one in the building. Brady said his very first reaction wasn't excitement about a potential promotion. It was the sobering realization that the only thing he wouldn't be anymore was the offensive coordinator, because he genuinely expected an entirely new coaching staff to walk in and replace everyone he'd worked alongside. He's been careful and deliberate about how he talks about stepping into this role, saying directly that he doesn't want to be Sean McDermott. He wants to be Joe Brady, his own version of a head coach built around continuity on the offensive side of the ball where things were already working at an elite level, while completely reimagining the side of the ball that kept letting this team down when championships were on the line. And that reimagining starts with the single most important hire Joe Brady has made since taking over: bringing in Jim Leonhard to run the defense. This isn't a small, symbolic coaching change. This is a genuine schematic revolution. After 9 years of McDermott's 4-2-5 base nickel defense built heavily around spot drop zone coverage and traditional four-man pass rush concepts, Leonhard is ripping the whole thing up and installing a base 3-4 front. Leonhard himself has been direct about the identity he wants this defense to carry, saying explicitly that Buffalo is going to be an attacking defense, aggressive up front and in the back end, a unit that goes and takes the football rather than sitting back and reacting. That represents a genuine philosophical departure from the defense that just cost McDermott his job. But here's what makes this transition genuinely risky rather than simply exciting, and it's worth being honest about the growing pains involved. This isn't a defense getting new terminology installed on top of largely similar personnel usage. This is players who were specifically drafted and developed over years to succeed in a 4-3-based system now being asked to fundamentally relearn their positions. The clearest example sits right at the edge of the defensive line, where both Greg Rousseau and Michael Hogt are converting from traditional hand-in-the-dirt defensive ends into stand-up outside linebackers with actual coverage responsibilities in space, a role that demands an entirely different skill set and an entirely different way of processing the game in real time. Analysts covering this transition have been careful to note that Buffalo genuinely does not have the luxury of a patient, forgiving timeline here. McDermott was fired after 6 consecutive seasons in which Buffalo won at least one playoff game, making this only the 4th franchise in NFL history to sustain that level of consistent postseason success. But the 3 previous franchises to accomplish that feat combined to win 9 total Super Bowls during their runs. Buffalo has won 0. The message from ownership could not be clearer. Anything short of an actual championship at this point is being treated internally as a failure, regardless of how the regular season unfolds. And that brings us directly to the voice that's been cutting through all of this offseason noise more than any other: Pro Bowl left tackle Dion Dawkins. Speaking to NFL Network's Good Morning Football, Dawkins didn't offer the usual safe training camp platitudes about optimism and fresh starts. He delivered something closer to a warning shot aimed at his own locker room. Everybody has to be better, he said. Everybody has to carry part of that weight so this team can finally get over the hump and become what it's actually capable of being, instead of talking about it year after year. He called it kill or be killed. He said Buffalo is not playing around with anybody this season. That is not the language of a veteran preparing for another comfortable division title chase. That's a player who watched a genuinely excellent head coach get fired despite years of sustained regular season success, and who fully understands exactly what message that decision sent to every single person still in that building. Nobody's job is safe anymore just because the record looks good in December. The only number that actually matters now gets counted in January. There's a genuinely dangerous psychological trap buried inside all of this urgency, though, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than just celebrating the newfound intensity. When a roster reaches the point where the regular season itself starts to feel like a formality, where winning 14 games generates a shrug instead of a parade because everyone's already looking past it toward the only outcome that matters, that's exactly the environment that has historically swallowed talented, well-built teams whole. Become the exact kind of suffocating environment that makes players press instead of play. So where does that leave Buffalo as training camp actually begins? Josh Allen remains, by nearly every reasonable measure, the best quarterback in professional football right now, capable of authoring touchdowns out of situations that would end drives for almost any other team in the league. That much hasn't changed and isn't going anywhere. What has changed is the surrounding infrastructure and, more importantly, the accountability structure sitting on top of it. Joe Brady inherits a genuinely explosive offense and has to find a way to keep it dangerous without asking Josh Allen to personally rescue every single broken play and every desperate third down, the way this roster has quietly leaned on him to do for years now. Jim Leonhard inherits a defense that has, in the most devastating moments of 3 separate seasons, allowed 32 points in an AFC Championship loss to Kansas City, watched Kansas City drive the field with 13 seconds remaining in a game everyone in Buffalo still can't fully talk about, and surrendered 33 points to Denver in the exact game that ended Sean McDermott's tenure. Those aren't just painful memories. Those are the specific recurring failure points that Leonhard's entire scheme change is being built to solve on an accelerated timeline with players who were never developed for this specific defensive system in the first place. Buffalo Bills fans have waited an extraordinarily long time for a different ending than the one this franchise keeps producing. 4 Super Bowl losses in the early 90s. Years of Josh Allen producing genuinely historic offensive football without receiving the defensive or situational support needed to finish the job when it mattered most. A fan base that has earned, through pure sustained devotion, the right to finally see this era end differently than every previous one has. Josh Allen gives this organization the ability to beat literally anyone on a given Sunday. Joe Brady has been handed the opportunity to build his own identity as a head coach rather than simply inheriting someone else's. Jim Leonhard carries the specific responsibility of fixing exactly the failure point that ended his predecessor's tenure. And Dawkins has already put the entire locker room on notice that comfort is no longer an option. Now it's simply a matter of whether all of that accumulated pressure sharpens this football team into something that finally breaks through, or whether it becomes one more heavy weight for a roster that has already been carrying enough of them for far too long. Bills Mafia, I want to hear directly from you on this one. Do you believe firing Sean McDermott, despite his incredible regular season track record, was ultimately the right call for this organization? And do you trust Jim Leonhard's new defensive scheme to actually fix the late-game collapses that have haunted this team in 3 separate championship-level losses? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, because I know this is one of the more emotionally complicated storylines in recent Bills history. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single piece of Bills coverage as training camp gets underway. Go Bills!